Welcome to the AEI Education Podcast on the AEI Podcast channel. I'm Nat Malkus, resident scholar in education policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Look, our podcast is simple. We bring on guests at the center of research, policy, and practice issues that are affecting families, students, and schools. After tragic school shootings occurred again in Parkland and Santa Fe, lawmakers and the public again have scrambled to find ways to make students safer. This mad dash has sometimes left little room to consider the evidence and data on school safety. To discuss this today, I brought together two guests. First, I'll talk with Dewey Cornell, professor of education at the University of Virginia, about fears and facts on school safety and the importance of focusing on prevention to keep students safe. Then, I'll have a conversation with Ken Trump, president of National School Safety and Security Services, about practical steps schools can take to be prepared in an emergency. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Dewey Cornell. Dr. Dewey Cornell, thanks for coming on the AEI Education Podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, I want to start out with just a basic understanding that the public has developed around school shootings. So there's a long string of them, and so many that they seem to kind of fade into this hazy chronology. It does in my mind, and I'm an education scholar. But of course, they're terribly traumatic, and so you seem to have this vague memory, but it always seems top of mind when another awful event like Parkland or Santa Fe comes around. So they seem like a continual threat. And then you look at the data, statistics, and that provides a very different and perhaps less compelling narrative. So how safe are schools really, and how is the public's opinion maybe out of sync with that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, every school shooting is a tragedy, and understandably, the public is very concerned about school safety. But I think there are some misconceptions about school safety, and those misconceptions are leading us in the wrong direction. We want to keep our kids safe. We want to keep them safe in school, but we also want to keep them safe outside of school. And if we look objectively at the risk to young people, they're actually in far more danger outside of school than in school. For every student murdered in a school, there are, unfortunately, 1,400 or more students murdered outside of school. For every shooting in a school, there are 1,600 shootings that result in death or injury to someone outside of a school. So I think school shootings are certainly a very important problem. We're certainly doing a lot of work to try to prevent school shootings, but we have to keep in mind the larger perspective.
Sure, but sort of to push back on that, I think a lot of the public would say, that's true, but school shootings are a different kind of crime or a different kind of tragedy by their very nature. You have a concentration of innocent kids. They're in one place. At least by some standards, it's not very well secured or guarded. And these kids are in someone else's, not the parent's custody. So certainly there has to be some distinction when we're trying to prevent school shootings from happening.
Well, certainly there are distinctions, and they have implications for what kind of prevention efforts we make. But I would suggest to you that a child being murdered, whether it's at school or outside of school, is still a tragedy and still something we want to avoid. And although we get aroused emotionally about the scenes of school shootings, we have to keep in mind that there are children at risk all over. There are more homicides in restaurants than in schools. So when a parent tells me that she's afraid to send her child to school, logically, statistically, she should be 10 times more afraid to send her child to a restaurant. When we talk about arming teachers at school, which would be a very extreme measure, very expensive measure, homicides occur 10 times more often in restaurants. Why aren't we talking about arming our cooks and servers? I think there's a misperception of danger at schools that is skewing our responses.
So let me ask you about that. So, a lot of this is fed by the media attention that, rightfully happens after these tragic events. But newspapers are not going to run headlines that say, students are comforted by school safety statistics after this school shooting. They run headlines that say, after Parkland, students feel unsafe. And I read one quote not too long ago where a student said, "I fear every day that I won't survive to the end of school," which I understand that as overblown, but there's two questions that stem from this. One is, how fearful are students? And perhaps more importantly, how can reactions to school shootings, policies that states and schools take to increase student safety, actually increase those sort of overblown fears?
Well, there is a short-term increase in fear after a school shooting. There's a fear of flying after there's a plane crash. These are understandable human reactions. But we have a school climate survey in Virginia schools, and we ask students whether they feel safe at school. We ask teachers whether they feel safe at school. And we know that the overwhelming majority of students, 80-90%, do feel safe at school. Now, we want that to be 100%, and we look at what the things that students are afraid of. Shootings, yes, are a concern, but I think we're overlooking that most students' security concerns, most students' fears have more to do with everyday bullying, harassment, physical fights than shootings. And I'd hate to see us divert resources from dealing with real and pervasive problems like bullying and harassment at school to deal with much rarer problems that are extremely unlikely to occur. Now, schools on average can expect a student homicide every 6,000 years because we've got over 100,000 schools, 125,000 schools, and about 20 homicides of students every year. So again, I know I'm giving you statistical arguments
Sure.
that they don't carry as much weight as those scenes of shootings, but I think we have to respond to fears with facts, with a rational approach, and recognize that there are student concerns that we should be addressing, but they're not necessarily shootings.
Yeah, I want to put a pin in the bullying and so forth because I want to come back to that. But let's just drill down a little bit on the school safety, school shooting reactions. It seems to me that there's sort of three big buckets that these fall into, and I'll present them to you and then ask you if you think I've got them right. I hear a lot about we need to harden the targets, right? Schools are unguarded, soft targets. Kids are sort of sitting ducks in here, and if we don't fortify them, then these things are going to continue to happen. So that's one bucket. And the second one is we need to focus on prevention. We can identify potential attackers early and stop this sort of event before it happens. And then a third one is sort of not focused on schools, but it's just gun control. Gun control is the problem. This isn't as much a school issue. It's a violence issue that goes beyond the school walls, and that we need to affect gun control in significant ways across the states to solve this. Do my three buckets sort of capture most of the reactions?
I think they do. Maybe there's a mental health treatment bucket that is emerging for discussion. But, my recommendation would be that we put some water in all three of those buckets. But I think right now the security bucket, the hardening the target bucket, is overflowing. We are spending literally billions of dollars in school security measures, cameras, detectors, bulletproof glass, electronic door locks, all kinds of security measures in schools. And the available evidence says they don't really make schools that much safer, and students don't feel safer in such schools. They're simply reminded that they're in what they think is a dangerous place.
Why do you think that there's such a popular reaction? Why is it so popular? Because I got to admit, the idea of arming teachers.
That you can do.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a tangible thing that you can do. That you can say, look, we installed these security devices, and I'm afraid that the school security business has gone overboard. Students do not need bulletproof backpacks. Every classroom does not need bullet-resistant glass.
Right.
Those are extremely remote possibilities, and if we're at that level that we're so afraid that we don't want to send a student to school without bulletproof clothing, they really shouldn't get on a school bus or in a car to drive to school, because there's far more risk on our roads than they are in a school building.
So how about prevention? Talk about the promises and difficulties.
Prevention, of course, is where I sit. I've developed a threat assessment model for schools that focuses on prevention. I've advocated for prevention measures for many years, as have many of my colleagues. What has happened is that school budgets are stretched. They're not elastic, and when they spend millions and billions of dollars on security measures, we look at counselors, psychologists, social workers, nurses in schools, and we see that they're understaffed and stretched too thin. There are kids who are in crisis, who are having troubles in school, and we don't have enough resources to help them. And, the irony is that I think a school counselor can do more to prevent a shooting than a security guard, because the security guard is only going to protect the school, that one building. But an effective counselor who diverts a young person from a pathway leading to crime might be preventing a shooting, anywhere in our community. So, I think to the extent that we can have more students be successful in school and be good citizens and have mental health problems and concerns addressed early, the more beneficial it will be, not just for shootings in schools, but shootings everywhere. Because as you alluded to, gun violence is a larger, broader problem than shootings that happen to occur in a school.
Well, that brings us to the gun control question, and pitch this response to skeptics who say, well, you can do as much damage with a legal weapon as sort of like a handgun than a semi-automatic weapon or assault style weapon and so forth. Sure. So make the case for gun control to combat school violence, school shootings.
Well, there are many different forms of gun control, many different measures, and studies have shown that states that have more safety measures, that is, they have more restrictions on how quickly and easily you can buy a high-powered weapon, restrictions on who can buy a weapon, so that individuals who have engaged in some kind of criminal activity or some kind of threatening activity have limitations on their access to firearms. States that have those measures have lower rates of gun violence. There's even a study finding that states that restrict access to these high-powered weapons have fewer school shootings. Now, the number of school shootings is so low compared to the total number of shootings that we have in our community that the impact of gun control measures is going to be largely on the community as a whole. So, one organization that reported that we've had about 300 school shootings or schools where shots were fired since the Sandy Hook shooting about 5 years ago. But in the same time period, we've had over 500,000, over 500,000 shootings in which someone was killed or injured, and who knows how many other shootings where no one was injured. So the real problem is gun violence here, and there is evidence that the states that have the strongest gun laws have the least amount of gun crime. And so I think there's some promising things we can do without repealing or abrogating the Second Amendment that allow people to have access to firearms, but also pose some reasonable restrictions on firearm access that can have an impact.
So let me ask you about a potential fourth bucket that I don't hear much talk about, but seems to make some sense to me. So this fourth bucket could be that, we just need the systems that are in place now to work a little better. And, I would say that, as far as systems that we have in place to connect schools that are flagging students that have that are at risk for so sort of violent episodes and so forth, we have ways for them to communicate with law enforcement, we have school counselors, and a lot of the time, kids that are moving in this direction, the school does turn them around. I mean, this is an article of faith on my mind, but I think that we do have teachers in schools that present caring environments and also have ways to flag students that are going down a dangerous path. And then just occasionally we have this nightmare scenario when an extremely disturbed student slips through the system. Is that right? Could we just look to do what we do better, or do we need, in your mind, to add additional pieces to our sort of school security?
I think we have a good understanding that we can prevent aggressive behavior and violence among young people. There are literally hundreds of controlled scientific studies showing that school-based programs, mental health counseling and supports, will reduce the level of aggressive behavior and violence in a school. We also know that helping children be more successful in school, not be suspended and kicked out of school, increases the graduation rate and reduces the juvenile court dockets. But what we have is a real lack of funding for mental health services in schools because school budgets are tight, and that seems like a peripheral, less important service than, of course, teaching the 3 R's.
Right.
And certainly we need good instruction in our schools, but we have to recognize that we have a lot of troubled kids in our schools, and just kicking them out of school doesn't really solve any problem. And so I think you're right that we have a lot of tools in place. We have a lot of things that we know could work, but we haven't really put our funding and our willpower behind making them work.
So let me ask you a quick question about sort of trying to get an evidence base, especially around school shootings. You know, it's obviously difficult to even invoke the idea of a cost-benefit analysis in these contexts. Kids' lives are obviously priceless, but of course, we have to pick the best response. And you have written about how much gets spent on school safety. What I'm also interested in is how do we develop evidence so we can gauge the benefits of a particular response, especially when school shootings are such rare events?
Yeah, so statistically rare events are it's very hard to measure that what you're doing has an impact on them. But Virginia was the first state to mandate the use of threat assessment in schools. That's a strategy that was recommended 20 years ago by the FBI and Secret Service, and many schools across the country are using that approach. And what we're finding is that it has many, many benefits beyond simply trying to measure whether you've had a school shooting or not. We know that we can reduce suspension rates for kids. We know that we can increase mental health services for kids. And we've looked at school climate surveys in those schools in Virginia using threat assessment, and we find that students and teachers feel safer in those schools. So I think there are ways that we can measure the effectiveness of prevention. Even though, in Virginia, we have not had a K-12 homicide in 20 years.
Wow.
And so it's a very rare phenomenon. But we also know that we have high suspension rates of kids throughout the country. We have racial disparities in suspension rates. And programs like threat assessment give us a way to handle difficult situations and potentially dangerous students without resorting to just, kicking them out of school.
Yeah, let me ask you about the root of all these problems and whether it's consistent. So you've just mentioned and you've done work on school climate, on bullying, on suspensions and sort of discipline policies, as well as school shootings. So my question is this just a continuum? Is the root problem underlying them all sort of the same one, and school shootings are just the extreme manifestation of that root issue that the climate in the school can either be more or less prone to violence and dysfunction?
So if we look at individuals who commit mass shootings, whether in a school or outside of school, there's not a single profile. They're not all the same. But we do see individuals who tend to have a history of being unsuccessful, being unhappy, being distressed. Many of them have serious mental health problems that date back to their school years. Many of them had difficulties in school, felt harassed, bullied, mistreated in school. And so there is a large proportion of these individuals that we could have helped through schools, through mental health services, through more effective academic programs in schools. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the problem is in the school or caused by the school. We could talk about family, community factors. We could talk about other influences. But it happens that school is a key resource. It's a key way to have a positive impact on young people. And so it certainly makes sense that we use that as a way to prevent violence community-wide.
All right, Dr. Dewey Cornell, a lot to think about. We can hope that this year some of these threat assessments and other measures may give us a year without a school shooting. That would certainly be nice. Thank you for coming on to the AEI Education Podcast to discuss your work with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Our conversation with Dewey Cornell gave us a great overview of fears versus facts on school safety, the importance of prevention efforts like threat assessments to stop violence before it begins. However, to discuss practical steps schools can take to be as prepared as possible in an emergency, I also had a conversation with Ken Trump, the president of National School Safety and Security Services. Ken Trump, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's good to be with you.
So, after Parkland, of course, the attention of the nation was focused on school safety and particularly on the danger that active shooters can pose for tragic consequences like Parkland. But Ken, you have been in the school safety business for a long period. So you've seen this cycle, and I wonder if you can just share the broader view of how we think about school safety and how the peaked attention that comes after these relatively rare events shapes the way we deal with school safety.
Well, active shooters are high-impact but low-probability incidents, and we have to address them on the school safety continuum of threats. But we also have to remember that on a day-to-day basis, there are many other threats to school safety, from bullying and aggressive behavior to non-custodial parent issues, weather and natural disasters, and a host of other challenges that face school leaders on a day-to-day basis that are much more likely to occur, but perhaps have a lower impact than a school shooting. One of the challenges that we're looking at, and I'm actually focusing my doctoral research on at Johns Hopkins in their School of Education, is the challenges school administrators face in communicating with parents, the media, and the school community about school safety issues and crisis incidents when there's a context of high ambiguity and uncertainty. And school administrators hope to communicate on a cognitive, rational basis while parents are in an emotional state.
Yeah,
and that's an oil-water mixture. So we need to find a way where we can bridge that gap so that we can talk about best practices, still address the parent concerns, but not make knee-jerk policy reactions and change what we do just for the sake of dealing with the emotional piece that it may not really make schools safer.
Sure. Well, Parkland is certainly, a case study of that, where you have just a great deal of desire to do something, do anything to make sure that this doesn't happen again. What are some of the things that you noted that came through that you thought, well, I don't know if that is the kind of reaction that we need? I mean, we have talks about more security officers on campus, arming teachers. You have bulletproof backpacks and whiteboards. It runs the gambit. How do we make decisions on these things?
Well, I always ask, if we need a bulletproof backpack, wouldn't we need a bulletproof front pack, a helmet, and a Captain America shield to go along with that? We have to listen to these ideas and voices, but also realize that the real question is, how would this really work? And when you think about metal detectors, that gives people sort of that instant satisfaction. Okay, we're going to have a more secure environment like a courthouse or an airport. But think about it. You're going to have to have kids come in an hour, 2 hours early. You're going to have kids waiting in line to get through school. They're going to be you're creating a target-rich environment if somebody had ill intentions to attack those kids while they're waiting. Yeah. It still doesn't account for bus stops and on school buses. You would have to run it 24 hours, 7 days a week, or I could come in with weapons, put them in a locker at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening during basketball practice or play practice or other extracurricular activities, come in clean in the morning through the metal detector and still get to the weapons and accomplish it. So we have to make sure that we're talking about what works. There's a skewed focus on physical security, hardware and security equipment that really concerns me, particularly after the Parkland incident, Santa Fe, and the spate of incidents that we've had this year. And what we know is that technology and equipment can be a supplement to the people in, but school safety is really a people issue. I do expert witness work on school safety lawsuits. I'm a defense retained expert on Sandy Hook. I have multiple other active shooter cases, rape, sexual assaults, child abductions from school, and while the facts and merits of these cases vary, the common thread across the board is that they involve allegations of failures of people, procedures, and systems, not allegations of failures of products and hardware.
Sure. Well, Ken, that makes me think as a people problem, one of the responses that we've seen a lot of is, well, let's increase drills. Let's have more lockdown drills, more active shooter drills. That's sort of a look to prevention, a look to sort of help people anticipate the worst. On the one hand, that has a certain logic to it. On another, that seems like there's a potential to increase fear among students, to normalize the idea that we should be awaiting for an active shooter. I wonder what the prevalence of these drills are and whether you think that they're actually effective, particularly with these higher profile events that push schools to do, active shooter drills.
We've got 20 years of experience showing that basic lockdowns work. There are some now who advocate teaching children to throw things and attack gunmen, throw a pencil case or an iPad. Well, first of all, that doesn't make sense, but it also doesn't connect with age and developmental issues, special needs children. We have children with emotional and behavioral disorders, autistic children, kids with mobility impairments. The mere fact that we know that the executive function of the brain is not developing fully until the mid-20s, and we're asking kids to make close combat decisions in split seconds that even our trained law enforcement and military professionals practice for all the time in their careers and still struggle with when it comes to implementation time. So I think that we really need to look at that line of reasonableness. What the best practices show that work over the past 20 years, and resist that temptation to go over the top to meet the emotional security needs that some have, as to what I call a do something, do anything, do it fast, and do it differently mentality today, because we may be doing more harm than good for a low probability incident where we need to be focusing on many other safety concerns.
Well, let me push back a little bit on this and just challenge the perception of where reasonableness gets us. So active shooter situations are a reality in America. They are very rare. We can do lockdown drills that are a little bit more broadly, or we could actually do active shooter drills, and some schools are doing them. So I guess my question is, with such a rare event, is it worth doing active shooter drills in every school in the country, even once a year? Is that going to move us forward on safety, or does that not seem like it's actually going to make kids safer? And, if you have to do that once in every school in the nation in a given year, it's just an awfully high cost.
Well, I think the question is, first of all, what do we define as an active shooter drill? In some places, active shooter drill is defined by some as a lockdown. In other places, it's a full-scale tactical exercise where you have uniformed SWAT team members coming into classrooms and having kids throw things at them. I don't think that latter scenario is reasonable or necessary at this time.
Right.
I think that if we focus on those basic fundamental best practices in emergency planning for schools, having lockdown drills, diversify those drills, do one during lunch period. Do one between a class change, perhaps different scenarios instead of just doing it at 9, 10 in the morning when it's convenient for adults who don't want to do it during lunch.
Right.
But I really think that we have to focus on those police-controlled evacuations as something. But we also don't need to do these every day or even every month.
Right.
A couple times a year is reasonable for a lockdown. Take a look at diversifying over a period of time so you can work through things. But it shouldn't dominate the scene where we have children who are told and encouraged, and teachers who are told and encouraged to actively attack a hypothetical gunman. I mean, there's one report that a school insurance company has paid more than $1 million in workers' comp claims for teachers and staff members injured over 22 months just in active shooter training. So we have to say, is this professional development, and is this the best practice, and is it aligned with the probability of the threat?
I wonder about the marginal dollar, right? So, we have a high a desire, I'm sure, among policymakers to do something, and so there's a willingness to spend money now. That willingness may sort of go away further down the line to do some of these drills or some of these more expensive things. So my question to you, sort of the last question to wrap up, when in an average school, where is the best place for them to put their marginal dollar? Is it in drills or is it in resource officers? Could it be in school counselors and making sure that kids have counseling? I know that's an impossible call, but where would you ballpark it?
I think that it has to be balanced. We know that what works includes creating a culture and climate where kids come forward and they report to concerns to an adult that they trust, having emotional and behavioral and mental health supports for students, having reasonable security and emergency planning without going over the top, including reasonably diversifying drills, but making sure you're looking at a variety of weather, natural disaster, and other things, not just active shooters, and focusing on staff training and prevention along with reasonable preparedness. It's not an either-or situation. It should be an and the gray area is where do we not cross that line?
Well, it's certainly worth getting schools safe, but like anything else in education, it's complicated and difficult to strike the right balance. Ken, thanks for your work on this and helping thanks for your willingness to talk to us about how to keep schools safe, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's great to be with you and appreciate your attention to it.
Thanks for listening to the AEI Education Podcast on the AEI Podcast channel. And special thanks to our guests, Professor Dewey Cornell and Ken Trump. You can subscribe to the AEI Education Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. And if you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes or Google. We are looking for a new name, and if you have any suggestions for what our future name should be, send them to us at ed.podcast@aei.org. You'll get a shout-out if your suggestion is chosen. And if you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions for future episodes, you can reach us at ed.podcast@aei.org. Signing off for today, I'm Nat Malkus.